Hello, everybody. It's my enormous pleasure to introduce the woman that we're all here to hear from, scholar, writer, activist Shoshana Zuboff, who's the author of three major books, each of which signal the start of an entirely new era in technological society. Her most recent work, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, has been hailed as the tech industry's silent spring and the Das Kapital of the 21st century. Ms. Zuboff is the Charles Edward Wilson Professor Emerita at the Harvard Business School. Welcome, Shoshana.
Madhu, it's so good to see you.
Yeah, lovely to see you too. The last time we spoke, I was working on a piece about China and the internet. And I remember finishing that conversation and just being so inspired and going away and rewriting an entire section of my piece. So I'm really excited to hear from you today. Only 10 or 11 weeks after we last spoke, but an entirely different world. And I'm going to hand over to you. You're going to give us an introduction to what you've been working on for the last months, and then we'll have a discussion from there on.
Thank you, Madhu, and thank you, Eleanor. It's so good to be with everyone who's watching with us and who will be watching with us. I want to start with just a bit of a metaphor, the idea of a stress test. You know, back when we had the Great Recession, we consider that to be a stress test on our financial systems. Well, right now it's turned out that the pandemic has been and continues to be a stress test for our democracies. And under pressure, I think it's clear to all of us now that so many of our vulnerabilities as democratic societies have been laid bare. The extreme social and economic inequalities, the poverty and racism that these have produced, the degradation of social trust, our profound institutional and leadership inadequacies. There are many issues that we could discuss here, but I want to draw attention to what I think of as a master thread that weaves its way across all of these different vulnerabilities and challenges that we have, and that are especially being revealed to us now. And this master thread is the digital transformation, the huge structural shift that our societies have gone through into the digital. Now, what's not often recalled or even clearly understood is that this structural shift has been incredibly abrupt. In 1986, only 1% of the world's information was stored digitally. By the year 2000, that was 25%. And by the year 2007, that was about 97%. So in that period, especially those 7 years, 2000 to 2007, we can liken this to something like an asteroid just plowing into the Earth, punching into the Earth's surface without warning, with tremendous force and immediacy. Suddenly, species going extinct, other species finding new habitats, climate systems being disoriented, everything happening in an instant. And this is kind of like what's happened to us. We have gone through this change so abruptly that it has impeded our ability to grasp and to respond to the real trauma and consequences of this shift. That trauma and our inability to understand was further institutionalized on September 11th, 2001. Before the date of that terrible tragedy on 9/11, if you were on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., the discussions that people were having about the internet and about the fledgling internet companies were discussions about the real need for comprehensive federal privacy legislation. And there was already an understanding that these internet companies were not going to be able to successfully self-regulate. Within 12 to 24 hours after the Twin Towers were hit and the unfolding tragedy of 9/11, the conversation changed radically and dramatically. Now it changed from privacy to the phrase that we have come to know as total information awareness, a new determination on the part of our governments and our intelligence agencies, beginning in Washington, that they had to know everything, and that total certainty was going to become the most important criteria for public policy, for the intelligence agencies, for the defense departments, and so forth. What emerged from this was an unwritten doctrine that I call surveillance exceptionalism. The idea here was that instead of privacy legislation, instead of regulating these fledgling companies, the real issue now was going to be how to give them the widest berth possible, how to nurture them, how to keep them free of law, regulation, and other impediments, so that they could use their advantages in the private sector to develop the surveillance capabilities already nascent in those companies, to develop those surveillance capabilities that the intelligence agencies and other government agencies would not be able to develop. What distinguished those little companies in the private sector? What distinguished them was the fact that because they were private, they did not come under constitutional constraints. They did not come under the laws and the democratic oversights that constrained the work of even our most intensive intelligence operations. So the idea here was the government would be able to get access to the growing capabilities of these fledgling companies, and they would be able to freely pursue their new surveillance capabilities unconstrained by law and democratic oversight. That is surveillance exceptionalism. The result of that, let's fast forward to 2013. The result of that is that our intelligence agencies, our law enforcement agencies became increasingly dependent upon massive flows of human-generated information being produced by these private sector companies. So much so that by 2013, Michael Hayden, former director of the CIA and the NSA, told the press in a public meeting that looking back on it, the CIA in those years following 9/11 and in the context of this new public-private relationship between the tech companies and Washington, that the CIA could, quote, be fairly charged with the militarization of the World Wide Web. This means that the last 2 decades have put us on a collision course with democracy. What was the fruit of this new public-private blurring of boundaries, this melting of boundaries? The fruit of that is that something came out of that private sector that was an entirely new mutation of capitalism, an entirely new approach to wealth creation. And that is what I have called surveillance capitalism. Surveillance capitalism based on this unwritten doctrine of surveillance exceptionalism, essentially endowing these companies with a license to steal our private experience, to steal our personal information, to turn it into the behavioral data that ultimately moves through those companies for analysis, for sales, but also has at critical times become available to our intelligence agencies when and as they needed it. The result has been that over these last 2 decades, those fledgling companies have morphed into massive surveillance empires, trillion-dollar information empires, and we now enter the 3rd decade of the digital century, marked by an unexpected pattern of extreme concentration of knowledge and the power that accrues to that knowledge. This means that rather than the democratization of knowledge, we encounter ourselves now with a new pattern of social inequality that I call epistemic inequality, differences in what we can know, marked by this growing gap between what I can know and what can be known about me. Extreme differences in knowledge produce extreme differences in power, and that widens the abyss between what I can do and what can be done to me. These new social inequalities mean that epistemic inequality, the difference between what I can know and what can be known about me, has now turned into a critical zone of social contest in our time. And it is this contest that we see so vividly displayed in our issues over pandemic, over tracking, over all of the information challenges that have been visited upon us because of pandemic. And we see them now as well in our protests, in the demonstrations that have been happening, not only in my country, but worldwide, where epistemic inequality as a zone of contest is at the forefront. Finally, to complete, the consequence of surveillance capitalism, the consequence of surveillance exceptionalism, of how we have allowed this to root and flourish over the past 2 decades could not be greater. Here is what it means. As a result of this unwritten doctrine, the liberal democracies have failed to produce the charters of rights, the legal frameworks, the legislative and regulatory paradigms, and the new institutional forms that are required in order to anticipate a digital future that is also compatible with democracy, a digital future that amplifies and extends democracy. This failure is in stark contrast to China, for example, an authoritarian state with a very clear vision of a digital future, and that has systematically advanced its own form of government, authoritarian government, through its domestic design and deployment of digital technology and its systematic efforts to design its foreign policy around the deployment and export of surveillance technology and social control protocols to countries around the world in literally every region. Where we are now, right now, as we face pandemic, as we face protest, we are reaping the whirlwind of this failure. We are now entering the 3rd decade of the digital century. The good news here, my friends, is that the digital century is still young. We have an opportunity to turn this around. The digital century must be the time now in our 3rd decade where we move together as lawmakers, as citizens, as warriors for democracy, finally doubling down on the creativity and the fertile effort of invention that is required to produce the laws and the institutions that we need to take us forward into a digital future that is compatible with our aspirations as a digital society. We double down on democracy now. And that is how we win back the future for ourselves and the generations to come.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was an amazing kind of distillation of the issues. We've got so many questions coming in from the audience, but I think I have a few minutes to ask you some of my own, or just to generate, just to kind of spark the discussion. One thing that we've talked about in the past, or rather in the recent past, is the pandemic itself and how that has become the new canvas against which we're now looking again at the challenges brought about by big tech companies, small tech companies as well, and the surveillance economy that they've created. So what do you believe that the progress, or the issues that had been addressed previous to the pandemic, where people were protesting, lawmakers were starting to regulate or think about regulating tech, are we going to go backwards because people are worried about their health, or are we going to keep going, resist the urge to kind of flee from protesting tech and actually continue to fight back and kind of gain our privacy back? What are your thoughts? Which way are we going to go? With the pandemic as a turning point.
Thank you, Madhu. I'm so glad that you asked this question. Look, the easiest thing to do right now is to predict doom and dystopia. In a general principle, folks, when we're talking about the future, never predict the future as a straight line from the present. That's just not how it works. I see something very different happening, Madhu. What I've been arguing for a while now is we are not headed toward dystopia. We are headed toward a democratic resurgence. I've been saying that as a while. I know you've heard me say that. But I think now we have a growing body of evidence to actually support this idea.
Do you mean the protests? Are you referring to the protests as a form of
the protests are part of it, but let's start right from the beginning of the pandemic. The first scandal that emerged right with pandemic was the scandal about Zoom, right? Suddenly, Zoom, the discussion about Zoom as surveillance was a very narrow discussion in a small specialist group. I'm on some of those lists, and those discussions have been going on for a while. The Zoom surveillance discussion became a global discussion overnight. Now, the difference, Madhu, is that 2020 is not 2001. In 2001, when the internet companies were granted their license to steal so that they could develop these precious surveillance capabilities that our governments wanted, they were tiny little companies. They were making no money. We thought of them as these young geniuses who were heroically going to lead us into the future. That is no longer the case. They now own 20% of the market capitalization of the US stock market. They are massive information empires who are characterized by huge, unaccountable power, unaccountable to their markets, unaccountable to their users, unaccountable to their shareholders, and most of all, unaccountable to their democracies, as we have learned all too well. We are in a completely different kind of world now. My headline for this, Madhu, is that there is too much toothpaste out of the tube. Just in the last year in the US, where lawmakers have been very reluctant to get behind these issues, just in the last year, we have seen 26 very important bills, pieces of legislation being introduced to Congress from the House or the Senate or both. We're seeing significant legislative and committee efforts in the UK. We're seeing incredible work coming out of the EU and the European Commission, incredible leadership from Commissioner van der Leyen, Vestager, and Juve. The work that they're doing is drawing a line in the sand between democracy and these tech empires. And we're looking at survey data and public opinion all around the world, which is saying in various ways in different surveys, I can quote you the numbers if you like, enough is enough. This has become intolerable, and we will not stand for it. So I don't think that there is a way back. And if anything, we are hyper aware and we are ready to resist.
So that's a much more kind of positive takeaway than the 2 decades that have brought us here, because the way your book sets it up, it kind of, you know, puts the fear of God into you, and you realize how this economy has mushroomed beyond any individual's control or any individual institution's control. But I guess where we are here, it feels like despite the pandemic and, you know, the slew of other tectonic changes, you're saying that democracy can and will prevail. And hopefully we'll see that in action in the coming months and years as we also address the fallout of the pandemic. So I'm going away quite heartened about the future for my children. And hopefully when I come back, you know, we'll still be talking about privacy and not just about, you know, how there's no time to speak of it at the moment.
Absolutely. And just remember that 20 years, as long as that may seem, is a very, very short amount of time, historically speaking. Surveillance capitalism is young. It's still baby steps. We let it go another 10 years, then we've got some real problems on our hands. But recall, democracy is old. I put my money on democracy. We have a lot of experience. We have a lot of institutional depth. We've handled worse challenges than this before, and we have prevailed.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to hand back to Eleanor.
Madhu, Shoshana, I mean, how brilliant that was. I feel I have a pain here that was so short. But I am delighted that you are going to be doing a Q&A session. So members of the audience, you can click into the Q&A. If you go back into the app and find the Q&A for leadership stage, you'll find Shoshana Zuboff's name there, and you just need to click in. I can see that there's been some brilliant questions come in through the Slido and the audience. So I think you're going to have more amazing conversation there. We're so thrilled and honored you came to give us your time, Shoshana, and to you too, Madhu, and the best of luck with your young daughter. And I very much hope that Shoshana's right and that the future is a much brighter one for her and for all of our children.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.